Julian had always considered himself special, an exceptional talent, someone who belonged to a rare breed of musicians. He was a pianist, but not just any pianist. He was the pianist. His fingers danced effortlessly over the keys, creating melodies that seemed to captivate everyone in the room. Whether it was an intimate concert or a grand performance for thousands, Julian knew how to leave his audience in awe. Julian had been trained in the finest conservatories from a young age. His parents, both prominent figures in the arts world, had spared no expense in giving him the best education money could buy. From private lessons with the world's most renowned instructors to performances at prestigious venues, Julian had everything he could ever ask for. But despite all of this, there was something else Julian loved even more than his music: the feeling of being superior to others. He had grown up in circles where the rich and powerful celebrated each other's accomplishments, and he had grown accustomed to being praised, respected, and envied. He wasn't just a musician. He was an artist, someone who understood the intricate language of music like few others. He prided himself on the precision and technicality of his playing. He had spent years perfecting every note, every scale, and every piece. To him, music was about discipline, about following the rules, and about being flawless in everything he did. Anyone who didn't share this view was, in his mind, an amateur at best. On a quiet evening, Julian found himself at a high society event, a gala of sorts. The chandeliers sparkled above and the room buzzed with chatter. People sipped champagne and mingled, discussing everything from politics to art. The atmosphere was elegant and Julian felt right at home. He was well known here. His reputation had preceded him, and he knew that everyone in the room admired him from afar, even if they didn't always show it. As the evening progressed, Julian was invited to play a few pieces for the crowd. Of course, he agreed without hesitation. The moment he sat at the grand piano, everyone gathered around, eager to hear him perform. He started playing a well-known piece, one of his favorites. His fingers moved over the keys, each note falling perfectly in place. The music was smooth, flawless, and filled with a level of precision that only someone with years of training could achieve. The guests were mesmerized as always. Julian was lost in his music, feeling the familiar rush of satisfaction that came with being the center of attention. But then, something unexpected happened. As Julian was about to finish the piece, he noticed a woman standing near the edge of the room, watching him intently. She wasn't a part of the usual crowd of admirers. She wasn't dressed in the same luxurious clothes or sporting the polished look of the other guests. There was something simple about her, almost out of place in the glamorous surroundings. She had an air of humility about her, and her expression seemed more thoughtful than impressed. Julian couldn't help but glance at her, but he quickly returned his focus to the piano. Who is she? He wondered before brushing the thought aside. He was used to attention, both positive and negative. He didn't have time to think about anyone else while he was playing. After he finished the piece, the crowd clapped, and a few people offered him compliments. As Julian stood up from the piano bench, ready to retire from the performance, he caught the woman's eye once again. She approached him, her smile kind but not fawning. She was quiet for a moment, as if she were choosing her words carefully. "You're very talented," she said, her voice warm but not overly flattering. "You play with such precision." Julian nodded, a smug smile on his face. He was used to compliments like this. It was practically a given that people would praise his technical skill. But then the woman surprised him with her next words. "I used to play too, you know," she said. "Not at your level, of course. But I did enjoy it." Julian raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you play?" he asked, clearly amused. He couldn't imagine someone like her, someone so ordinary, ever having any serious connection with music. He doubted she had any real talent. People like her didn't play piano the way he did. "Well," she continued, "I played when I was younger. I don't have much time for it now. But I've always loved music." Julian looked her up and down, scanning her like he would any other person who didn't belong in his world. She didn't have the air of someone who had been trained by the world's top instructors. She didn't carry the same refined elegance as the musicians he was used to. "Maybe you should play something for us," Julian said, his voice dripping with a hint of sarcasm. It was almost a dare. The thought of this simple woman even attempting to play something on the grand piano seemed laughable to him. He was curious, but not in a respectful way, more out of a desire to put her in her place. The room was still, awaiting her response. For a moment, Carla hesitated. The idea of playing in front of all these people, especially after watching Julian perform so flawlessly, made her nervous. She wasn't the type to seek attention, but there was something about the way Julian had challenged her, almost as if he assumed she would fail, that made her feel like she couldn't back down. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose I could give it a try." The room seemed to hold its breath as she walked toward the piano. Julian leaned back slightly, confident that this would be over in seconds. He couldn't imagine that she could play anything of substance. Carla sat down at the piano. The keys seemed to almost shimmer under her fingertips. Julian couldn't help but notice how gracefully she sat, how natural her movements seemed despite her lack of experience in such a setting. She didn't immediately begin playing. Instead, she seemed to take a moment to gather her thoughts, to let the music settle within her. And then, without warning, her hands began to move. At first, it was just a simple melody. But then, as the notes began to flow, Julian felt something in the air shift. The simplicity of the melody carried with it a sense of emotion, something he hadn't expected. There was an honesty in her playing that surprised him. It wasn't about precision or technicality. It was about the feeling that she poured into each note. He watched as her fingers moved with a quiet confidence, not trying to impress anyone, but simply letting the music take over. Her style wasn't refined, and she didn't follow the perfect rules Julian had been taught to obsess over. But there was something raw and captivating about the way she played. It was as if she was telling a story through the music, something Julian had never truly done. He was so caught up in his technical mastery that he had forgotten what it meant to feel the music. The guests in the room were silent, listening intently. Some were surprised, others were moved. But Julian? He found himself slowly drawn into the music, even though he was trying to hold on to his pride. His eyes narrowed, trying to figure out how this simple woman could evoke such a reaction from him. How was this possible? He wondered. By the time she finished, the room erupted in applause. Julian stood still, frozen. He had expected this to be a moment of triumph for him, a moment where he could silently laugh at her. Instead, he felt something else entirely: humility. Carla's music had revealed something Julian had never truly understood about his own playing. There was more to music than perfection. There was something deeper, something that spoke to the heart rather than the mind. He hadn't expected this, and in that moment Julian began to question everything he thought he knew about being the best. Julian stood there, still frozen, his hands hanging loosely by his sides. The applause around him seemed distant, as if the room had become a blur of sounds, with one thing standing out clear above everything else: the music. The woman had finished, and now the room was erupting in claps and praises. But Julian was no longer hearing the crowd. His mind was consumed with what had just happened. He felt something unfamiliar, a deep discomfort, almost like a knot in his stomach. For years he had prided himself on his technique, his precision, his ability to make every note perfect. And yet, here was a woman who had none of the formal training he had. No fancy background, no prestigious education. And still she had done something he couldn't ignore. She had played not just notes but feelings, and those feelings had hit him in a way his perfect performances never had. As the applause died down, Julian slowly turned to face Carla. He wasn't sure what to say. He had expected to walk away from this encounter with the same sense of superiority he always carried. Instead, he felt small, almost as if he had been knocked off a pedestal he hadn't even realized he'd built. Carla, however, was calm. She didn't seem to expect anything from him. She didn't wait for his approval or for the crowd to praise her. She simply looked at him with the same quiet humility she had shown since she walked into the room. The only sign of her nervousness was the slight tremor in her hands as they rested on her lap. For a moment, Julian didn't know what to do. Should he pretend it didn't affect him? Should he remain the proud, untouchable virtuoso that everyone thought he was? Or should he do something entirely different? Acknowledge for once that there was more to music than he'd ever let himself see. Finally, he spoke. His voice was quieter than usual, almost hesitant, as if he was testing the waters. "You played with emotion," he said, his words fumbling as they left his mouth. He didn't know why, but the compliment felt like it came from a place of genuine surprise rather than a rehearsed response. Carla gave a small smile. "I suppose music isn't just about the notes, is it?" She replied softly, Julian didn't know how to respond to that. He had spent so many years thinking that music was nothing but a set of rules, a game of perfect execution, a world of precision where anything less than perfect was failure. He'd believed that technical mastery was the only true measure of success, and yet here was this woman, who had broken all those rules in the most beautiful way possible. He paused. The words didn't come easily, but they felt necessary. I never thought about it like that, he admitted. He was being vulnerable for the first time, and it felt strange. You're right. It's not just about getting every note right, is it? Carla nodded, her eyes still gentle but direct. Music is about connection, she said. It's about letting people feel something. If you don't put yourself into it, all you're doing is playing a set of sounds. Julian couldn't deny it. He thought about his own performances, the hundreds, maybe thousands of concerts he'd given over the years. The technical perfection, the admiration from his peers, the prestigious awards, but in all of it, had he ever truly connected with the audience? Had he ever played a piece because it spoke to him, because it came from within him? Or had it all been about showing off what he could do, how perfectly he could play? The more he thought about it, the more uncertain he became, the more he realized how much he had missed. I've always focused on perfection, Julian admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. I thought if I played every note exactly right, if I followed all the rules, that it would be enough. But maybe I've been wrong. Carla's smile deepened, but she didn't say anything. She simply let him sit with his thoughts, her quiet presence allowing him the space to think. And that was something Julian wasn't used to. He was used to being in control, to being the one who taught and who set the example. But here, in front of this woman who had no ambition to be a world-class pianist, he was the one learning. The more they talked, the more Julian realized how much he had taken his music and his life for granted. He had spent years playing the same pieces, following the same structure, chasing after approval. But what was he really trying to prove? Who was he playing for? Himself, the audience? Or was it just the validation he'd always craved from those around him? The conversation stretched on for a while, and Julian felt like a different person. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. He didn't have to be perfect. He didn't have to prove anything. He didn't have to be the best. Eventually, the evening began to wind down, and the guests started to say their goodbyes. Julian knew he should leave with the others, but he couldn't bring himself to. He stood at the side of the room, watching the crowd slowly thin out. But his mind was still racing, still caught on the conversation he had just had with Carla. She had given him something that he couldn't quite put into words, a new perspective on music, on life, and even on himself. And he hadn't even realized how badly he needed it. Carla, on the other hand, seemed completely unaffected by the impact she had made. She was already preparing to leave, quietly gathering her things as though the whole evening had been just another night for her. She didn't seem to expect anything from anyone. It was almost as if her music didn't require validation. That was something Julian couldn't ignore. He realized that her humility, her lack of pretension, was exactly what made her performance so powerful. She didn't need anyone to tell her she was good, because she already knew that what mattered most was that she had given something real. She had shared a piece of herself with the world, and that, in the end, was enough. As the last of the guests trickled out the door, Julian walked over to Carla. This time he didn't feel the need to prove anything. He didn't need to maintain his usual facade of superiority. He was simply a person, and so was she. I want to thank you, he said, his voice steady but sincere, for showing me something I didn't know I needed to see. You've opened my eyes to what music can really be. Carla looked up at him, her smile kind but without the arrogance that he had so often found in others. It wasn't just me, she replied softly. It's about being open to feeling something in the music. And I think you've always had that in you. You just needed to let go of the need for control. Julian nodded slowly, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. The journey he had thought was all about mastery and perfection had, in reality, been about letting go. Letting go of his pride, his arrogance, and his need to be the best. And for the first time, he felt like he had the space to truly grow as a musician and as a person. As the night ended and the last of the guests left the room, Julian found himself standing alone with his thoughts. He didn't feel defeated. He didn't feel lesser. He felt free. For the first time in years, he felt like he could embrace the beauty of imperfection, the emotion in music, and the understanding that there was always room to learn. And as he walked out of the venue, he felt like he was walking into a new chapter of his life, one where the music wasn't just about being the best, it was about being real.